Welcome everyone to this Pride edition webinar on why diversity and inclusion should matter in the workplace. Thank you for joining. I'm Isabel Wong, Lynk studio lead and the moderator of today's fireside chat on this both sunny and rainy day here in Hong Kong. The webinar is brought to you by Lynk Global and Community Business. Community Business is a non-profit organization founded in the year of 2003, whose mission is to lead, inspire, and support businesses to drive social change. They work with companies of all sizes across Asia to drive agendas such as implementing diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Meanwhile, Lynk Global is a technology platform that unlocks the knowledge and insights of advisors from around the world by connecting over 63,000 experts with business leaders. Well, ahead of this webinar, a great piece of news just came through overnight. It was that the US Supreme Court, in a landmark case, has ruled the federal anti-bias law actually covers millions of gay, lesbian, and transgender workers, making it illegal for employers to fire employees and reject job applicants purely based on their sexual orientation. 5 years after the US top court declaring a fundamental right for same-sex couples to marry. Meanwhile, there were some really encouraging recent developments over the past few years, such as Asia's first LGBTQ art show that happened in Mocha, Taipei a few years ago, as well as the subsequent legalization of same-sex marriage in Taiwan. Well, while the global LGBTQ community has come a long way, there's still a lot of work to be done in the workplace. So now, without further ado, I would like to bring in our speaker of the day, Peter Sargant. He's the CEO of Community Business. But before he joined the NGO, he was actually an executive director of Standard Chartered Bank, and he was a founding member of the Diversity and Inclusion Council in Hong Kong. He's also been recognized as a dedicated DNI and minority groups advocate through his work in the Diversity and Inclusion in Asia Network and the Hong Kong LGBTQ+ Inclusion Index and Awards. But before we begin the conversation, if you have any questions for Peter today, please feel free to use the Q&A function at Zoom. And if you're joining from your mobile phones, you can feel free to send us your questions through emails at linkknowledge.com. Sorry about that. We'll go through some of the questions from you guys in the Q&A session later on. More importantly, I hope you're enjoying this Tuesday afternoon conversation with a cup of tea and an open mind. But to start off the conversation, I would like to ask a very simple question. What does pride really mean to you? Because here at Lynk, we're currently doing a photo activity with our teams where team members, they were sharing photos of them holding a piece of paper with one word describing what pride means to them. And throughout the process, there were a lot of interesting answers that came through, and we realized that pride could mean a lot of things very differently to many people from different cultural backgrounds. Some of them said understanding, some of them said acceptance, some of them said expression, and some of them even said friend. So Peter, here's a question for you. What does pride mean to you?
Well, where do you start on that one? I mean, for me, it's kind of a celebration, but that is all sort of tainted by the fact that we're still fighting for some things that are just basic human rights. And you know, I saw the news coming out of the US overnight, and it's just absurd to me that that's even news in this day and age. You know, I mean, the fact that companies could fire people for being gay, it's just absurd. And so, you know, for me, pride is always a little bit of a battle between the need to really demonstrate and call out inequalities and the need to celebrate and recognize the people that went before us and actually fought for the rights that we have today. And it kind of takes me back, I mean, even asking that question, it takes me back to my very first Pride March, which would have been in London. I would have been in my early 20s. Like a lot of people who hadn't come out at the time, I was quite nervous about even being there, especially being seen to be there. And so I stood like 4 or 5 people back from the curb and watched things go by. And yes, of course, I was impressed by the colourful floats and the people celebrating. But what really struck me was seeing Peter Sargant demonstrating and seeing the placards and the call for for human rights, for LGBT plus people. And it really struck me that there was someone there that had a lot of courage and tenacity in really calling out those inequalities. And so the fact that we're still having to battle for those today, to me is just absurd. But if you look at that here in Asia, I recognize the privilege that I had in being able to stand at those demonstrations and those celebrations, because here in Asia, I've worked alongside volunteers that have been very courageous in terms of coming out to a Pride March, only to find themselves on the front page of a newspaper the next day when they haven't come out to their family and friends. So, you know, it takes a lot of courage to come forward and to be part of that dialogue, particularly when in your own family you have the challenges as to whether or not to come out. And so, you know, over the years, I moved further forward on that curve to being at the front of that parade of people watching. But I did that because I was in a safe space and could do that. And that's not the same for everybody. And that to me is what we're really fighting for during Pride Week, but also during the rest of the year, is to ensure that people have equality and they can stand forward and they don't feel ashamed or discriminated by doing so.
Yeah, from what you just described, it's still a challenge everywhere, especially in Asia, as for there's this question for an LGBTQ plus community member, as for when they walk into a place, they would always have the question of, is this safe for us to be who we are? So yeah, I do know you before you joined community business. So now you are in this new job for 3 months, but before that you were at this Standard Chartered Bank, and you were one of the founding members of the Diversity and Inclusion Council in Hong Kong. So I would like to talk a little bit about your role there, because of course we've come a long way, but just because we have a little bit of progress right now, it doesn't mean it wasn't challenging back then. So what were some of the key challenges you were trying to address back then?
Yeah, so thank you. I mean, it was interesting for me. So I came to Hong Kong in '97, just after the handover in October, November, and came into a society where I thought, you know, LGBT wouldn't be so much of an issue. And I don't ever think I really experienced any severe forms of discrimination, but there was certainly a lack of inclusion in terms of dialogues. And I think it was the same for most employers at that time in Hong Kong. And it was only through the formation of groups like Interbank, and more recently with the Hong Kong Lesbian and Gay Attorneys Network, and also Lesbians in Finance, that the community started to find its voice within business. And so for me, coming into Hong Kong and finding these groups and being part of those discussions, that was very encouraging, because it showed me that actually other companies were doing some great things. And so we could leverage on the experience of other organizations to help drive some of the initiatives we wanted to do internally. So for me, in the early days, it was very much a partnership, working not just with other organizations, but also with some of our clients and some of our competitors, because it was a common challenge for large employers in the city. How do they attract, develop and retain a diverse workforce? And how do they make sure that everybody in that workforce's voice can be heard and that they feel truly included? So, you know, for me, the early stages was kind of a discovery a journey in recognizing some of the things that were missing, but also looking for people that we could collaborate with to figure out how we fill those gaps. And so a good example would be when I was, actually this was also through community business. I met somebody who was working at Bloomberg at the time, who had newly moved to Asia and was quite astonished to find out that their insurance policies weren't really up to the standards that they were seeing elsewhere in the world. And they challenged their insurers and said to them, look, you know, we buy on a global basis and we expect these global standards in terms of coverage. And specifically, they were talking about exclusions for HIV/AIDS. And at that time, I was sitting on the board of AIDS Concern in Hong Kong. So I was really quite encouraged by the fact that there was employers doing that. And so I went back to my employer and said, look, what do we have? And sure enough, we had a bog standard insurance policy that had those exclusions, which of course wouldn't hold water today. But because nobody had challenged it and asked that question, the insurers still had those exclusions in there. So very quickly, through our group HR contacts and dialogues with our insurers, we were able to get those removed. But it took the collaboration with another organization that had some success in that field to recognize that actually it was just a discussion. And you know, as a big employer and a large buyer of insurance for our employees, and we had that kind of leverage. I think the challenge is for the smaller companies that perhaps don't have that leverage, learning from some of the larger companies and trying to work out how they work through those issues. And that for me was really the most important thing, was having that collaborative approach between organizations that would traditionally compete on other issues.
You just mentioned the challenges of small-sized firms facing in terms of this topic. So here's a question about the differences between these larger firms and smaller firms. Like, would you say there would be an equal amount of importance given to inclusion at the workplace across small and larger firms, private and public companies? What would be the differences in terms of the approaches?
Good question. I think if you look at the SME market, I think there's a specific challenge there, not just in Hong Kong, but in other markets. Particularly if you look at some of the smaller sort of mom and pop type organizations, which are much more local in terms of their employee base. They don't have the natural advantage you'd have of an international workforce that brings with it some of its international expectations. And so what I mean by that is for companies that are, say, operating in a more restrictive market, it's quite easy for them to look at a more advanced market and say, you know, these are our corporate policies, these are the standards that we hold ourselves to. Whether there's requirements within the market to have a certain standard, we'll hold ourselves as an employer of choice to this higher standard. A local company might not have that international reference or that international task force to fall back on. So what I would say there is the opportunity for us to collaborate with local companies to help share that international experience. And by that, I don't mean saying, you know, this is the way it's done in the West, this is how it should be done here, because there absolutely has to be a local flavor and nuance to that. But what I do mean is being able to share best practice and share experiences about what has and hasn't worked and how you overcome some of those challenges.
Yeah, would you be able to give us some examples as for what really worked in the Asian environment, and how can companies of all sizes here in Asia can really implement this important agenda in their workplace policies?
Yeah, so I think, like a lot of people starting work on LGBT inclusion, it doesn't come without its hurdles and without a number of failures. And I think you have to kind of go through that learning process to start off with. And I remember one of our first LGBT network events was arranged to meet up in a bar in Central for drinks. And not surprisingly, it ended up being, I think, 4 white men and 1 white woman. And so it was far from representative of the workforce or the LGBT network. And so, you know, the next time we did that, we thought about the venue, we thought about how we did it, and we thought about getting somebody else rather than us to organize it. But I think, you know, the big watershed for me was when we started doing Cantonese content. And so taking some of the things that we already had, translating them into Cantonese, and to that extent into Mandarin or Bahasa or wherever you're delivering the content, and then giving it some Asian specific examples. And that really was when things started to open up. I remember we did a session where we talked about coming out stories. And we had a number of different folks from our organization and other organizations come in and tell their story. And some of them were Asian stories and some of them were Western stories, but what they all had in common was a sort of overcoming of a perceived personal barrier in sharing their story. And what was interesting for me in publicizing that, the very morning of the event, I got a call from one of the big investment banks, one of the head of diversity there, saying, can I ask you, can I bring one of our senior executives along? And this particular gentleman did come along. But what had happened to him that morning at home was that he got into a fight with his son. I think his son was in his early teens. And his son stormed out of the kitchen. And as he left, he turned around and said to his dad, "Well, I'm gay, what do you expect?" And then slammed the door and left. And so this father was left in huge turmoil, thinking, you know, what did I do? I didn't get to have the appropriate conversation. It just took him completely off guard, and he felt absolutely terrible. So he'd gone into work that morning and said, sought out his head of D&I and said, "Look, can you help me?" And she said, "Well, it just so happens that Peter's running this session. Why don't you go along?" And he did. He came along and he heard all these various coming out stories. And through that, he realized that there was no right way to respond. And what he needed to do is just pick up that dialogue and let his son know that that was okay. But it was really empowering to know that just because you're doing something within your organization, it has a much broader impact on society. And so I would really encourage people to continue those kind of events and make sure they invite a broad spectrum within their audience, because I'm a firm believer in the fact that, discrimination just comes out of lack of exposure, lack of information, and to a certain extent, ignorance. Nobody is taught to be discriminatory. And so the more we can talk about the things that we do, and the more we can normalize that within local conversations, I think that the more progress we'll make. But sadly, we still need to do that, and that's the challenge, because for the gay community, I don't think you come out once, you come out multiple times, and every time you're educating somebody else. But that's important. That's important for us, but it's also important for the next generation that come after us.
Yeah, this is indeed a very important education as well as a conversation for the world, especially in light of the recent tragedy of George Floyd. This should have been a conversation that was happening way before the tragedy happened, because in light of the recent Black Lives Matter global movement, one of the themes that were frequently talked about was how, let's say, the group of white people, they could use their privilege to become a supportive ally for those who are in a more vulnerable position. So I would like to talk about some of the ways that people or with stronger voices or in a more powerful position, how can they really be an effective ally for these groups of minority people, LGBTQ communities, rather than just sharing their support, voicing out their support on social media? What are some of the actual things that they could do?
Good question. And I've been in this role now for 3 months, and most of those 3 months I've been doing it remotely from the UK. As you know, I'm now newly back in Hong Kong. I think I'm 3 days into my compulsory quarantine here, in what I have to say is a very nice apartment. And so, this is not a hardship quarantine by any stretch of the imagination, but that's not the same for everybody else. But what I would say is there's not been a day working at community business when I haven't personally had to challenge what my own privilege is. And I've had numerous conversations with my team about what is the right messaging, what should I be saying about gender equality, what should I be saying in relation to Black Lives Matters, and what specifically should I not be saying? And so I think if nothing else, well, I hope this movement achieves a lot more, but one thing that I hope it achieves is that it makes all of us question how effective we are as allies. And so what I would say to that is to be an effective ally to any kind of community, you have to ask that community what's effective for them. I mean, along the lines of nothing for me without me, you have to make sure that you're including the community you're trying to represent. So, the first thing I think that's of vital importance is to say that you are an ally. And let me use the transgender community as an example. Probably about 6 years ago now, I was speaking at an Out Leadership event in London, and there was a trans panel. And as part of the Q&A, I got an opportunity to ask a question, and I stood up and said, look, I want to be an ally to this community. I don't know enough about the community. I want to learn more about the community, but please recognize that I want to be an ally to you. And it was really interesting for me, the journey that I went on after that, because after that, a number of friends said, I have a flatmate that's transgender. I have a friend who's transgender. I myself am a transgender. And it's amazing when you say that you're an ally, how many people recognize that you're suddenly a safe place to have a more holistic discussion with. And so, quite naturally, then my learning and my education on how to be an effective trans ally leapt ahead, because I'd actually stated that was my intent. And I think, the same thing happens with racial inequality. You've got to say that that's unacceptable to me. And you've got to reflect on what your position of privilege is and how you use that effectively. But you've got to be very careful not to use it without checking with the community you're trying to represent what is appropriate for them.
Yeah, you're just describing a collaboration between like those who would be willing to stand out as a supporter and ally for these communities of people, while they need to be also actively communicating what is it that really helps them going through these kind of hard, tougher times. But I think one advice I would like to ask from you for, let's say, LGBTQ plus employees, especially the new joiners to the professional world, if they are also part of the LGBTQ plus community, what kind of a work environment will a new employee like them find themselves when they arrive, and what would you recommend them to do in terms of communicating, or whether or not they should be communicating? And the other question is, should there be any diversity training that you would recommend for existing staff coming up?
Well, that's a lot of questions.
Yeah, so I will simplify it to two questions. The approach of a newly joined employee or like a young employee when he or she also belongs to the LGBTQ community, how should they feel about themselves in the professional world, as well as the approach of existing team members in a company?
Yeah, I didn't mean that I was afraid of the questions. I just meant that there was a lot of ground to cover there.
Yeah.
What I would say is, I mean, I liked your question about, what can they expect to find when they arrive in the workforce. I think I would hope that if we've done our job correctly, they will find a better environment than the one we found, because generationally, I would hope that things have improved. I would say that they shouldn't go in expecting everything to be fixed, because it's not. And so, that's where I think companies should really, and I know a lot of companies do amazing work in this field, is really look to their diversity and inclusion training and ensure that it's appropriate for the markets they're operating in. And so one of the things I always say is, in some markets, people are using metrics to measure how they're doing on diversity and inclusion. And one of the metrics is often the number of people that self-identify as being part of the LGBT plus community. And for me, that's not really an effective metric in Asia, because expecting someone to come out and be public about about being gay is not necessarily appropriate in a market where it's a small community, and the chances are that somebody in their office knows somebody who knows their family. And so coming out in the workplace can quite often equate to coming out at home, and people might not be ready for that and shouldn't feel pressured into doing that in the workplace if they're not comfortable in doing that at home. And so I think, that can be somewhat different to some of the Western markets where there's quite a separation between the workplace and the home environment, just because of the proximity or the size of the populations. And so what I would say is a lot of companies, in fact, most of the companies that we work with have LGBT plus ally networks. And so these are a combination of both the LGBT plus community, but also the allies of that community. And quite often people identify as being part of that group, so an LGBT and ally community, rather than specifically being LGBT. And that to me provides a safe space for conversations, and also for people to be part of a dialogue around what's best for the community, rather than self-identifying as being part of that community, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So now I would like to move on to some of the questions that we got through the Q&A section, because we have quite a few of them coming through. So one of the questions is that, of course, you mentioned education is important, and it's also important to start young to educate children as for how they communicate this kind of issue. So the question is, how do we get more dialogue going on in primary and secondary schools? Because this participant said international schools, maybe in Hong Kong, they do a good job on how we instill this into local school, and what role can parents play? So her question is more about like how we can start this kind of dialogue in the local school communities in Hong Kong or in Asia.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and something that's quite close to my heart. I mean, I've just spent the last 3 months in the UK, and my sister is a teacher in Spain, and she was also in the UK with me teaching her kids in this Spanish international school online. So it was a constant battle over who had the office and who could be on Zoom. But one of the challenges with the online world, and one of the beauties of it is you get invited into people's homes. And so we were quite often sort of reflecting on the fact that, you know, as kids, kids don't see color, kids don't discriminate, and as they grow up, it's something that's kind of taught in some ways. I think the education system has a vital role to play in preparing kids for the outside world, but we shouldn't put everything on the educational system, because we know full well that some of the educational curriculums are not equipped to teach LGBT plus inclusion. And so what I see a lot of organizations do, particularly the grassroots LGBT organizations in the various countries in which we operate, is help schools and try and help influence curriculum development. But what I would say is it's something that the teachers should also be looking to do, because there are plenty of resources there that they can draw on, and you can easily look to the LGBT community to come in and assist with that. So I know, for example, here in Hong Kong, the Pink Alliance has done a tremendous amount of work in trying to help develop educational curriculum, and they've done a lot of work in trying to lobby government to improve things. But I think, you know, that families and parents have a role to play in this too. And so I think, you know, in the absence of a solid curriculum within schools, making sure that you're also equipped for that story. And so the example I would use there is, if you look at what we like to call rainbow families, so kids that have been born to LGBT plus members of the community. And, you know, 20, 30 years ago, this was a hypothetical discussion. Nowadays, these kids are in school. So these kids are part of the network of kids that the other kids are socializing with. And so developing a parenting story that they can tell to the other children in their class and be part of that dialogue in a way that they're not discriminated against and they're included is not just something that we should be doing. It's something that we should have done, because these kids are already in school. And so we should be playing catch up. And if schools are not teaching appropriate curriculum around this, then they're creating discrimination within their population. And so I think it's something that's of vital importance. And I think as parents, we should be demanding it of our educators. And as human rights activists, we should really be pushing the agenda on this, because, you know, those kids are not some hypothetical. These kids are growing up in a modern society where this is expected.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. The other question that came through from email was that about communication and the language used in terms of talking about this kind of issues. It's like, what would be your advice in terms of how to communicate effectively within a firm about their commitment to inclusiveness to employees without introducing stereotypes or languages that would be offensive to a small group of people?
Thank you. That's a really good question. I've always had a theory for the longest time that we get hung up on language, and language sometimes can be a barrier to discussion because people get so head up on using the wrong term that they end up not having a conversation. So the first thing I would say, it's more important to have a conversation than it is to get the language right. And you know, my own lived experience, my first role in diversity and inclusion was hosting a panel around disability. And I had 4 or 5 experts on my panel who knew way more about this subject than I did. But as a facilitator for the panel, I started my opening gambit by saying, you know, I'm going to get some of the language wrong here, but, you know, I want to be part of the dialogue and part of the solution rather than not have a discussion. So I would say, first of all, don't get hung up on it. The second thing I would say is around the LGBTQ plus alphabet soup that we keep creating is there is a educational tool that we put out just recently around Idaho and Pride Month, which actually goes through the acronyms and sometimes the acronyms that are represented by the plus. And so you can look there and it'll tell you all about that and give you some information. But I think the question is more about what can an organization do to show that it's LGBT friendly and inclusive. And I think there needs to be some very specific statements that sit within HR policy and within sort of within your operational manuals that people can look to. So, you know, when a new employee, when somebody comes for an interview, the first thing they'll have done is go onto your websites and look at your recruitment processes and look to see what it says there. And if there's nothing there, they will probably move on and look at somewhere else to work. And similarly, once someone's in your organization, if they're looking to see what their benefits are, if it's hidden away at the back of some policy somewhere, and you know, they will seek it out, but you need to make this much more overt. And so I think having the policies and having the procedures in place, but making sure that you're doing events that are specific for that community. In the same way that you might do a bring your kids to work day for your parents network. Think about how that looks to an LGBT family, and how they bring their children to work, and what issues that would likely raise for you, and how you'd manage them. And so I think, you know, you need to be very specific and very open about what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Peter. I think what you just answered also.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is just don't be afraid to ask for help on that, because there's a number of organisations that are doing great things in this area and have great experience, and so reaching out and asking people to come in and talk to your diversity practitioners, your HR practitioners, your campus recruitment professionals. Nobody has this completely fixed, otherwise we wouldn't still be having this conversation. So I would say just reach out.
Thanks a lot for your advice, Peter. From what you just said there, education and collaboration between many different groups of people are really key to the success of reaching progress in terms of reaching a general understanding about minority groups as well as the LGBTQ community. And also thank you so much for your time for this conversation today. That was Peter Sargant, CEO of Community Business. This is it for this Pride at Work Fireside Chat. Thank you all again for joining us this afternoon. And meanwhile, stay tuned for any upcoming events at Lynk and Community Business. Thank you so much and see you very soon.
Thank you. Bye for now.